I'm waiting for some people to get into the space over on X, and I'm just going to reach out to Bridget and see if she's going to be here today. I haven't heard from her. Oh, and they just crashed my space. Gotta love it. Gotta love it. All right, there we go. Let me send that off to her. Okay, I'm not sure if Bridget's going to be here today. I'm waiting to hear back from her, and I've got us up and going over on Rumble. So, as we're waiting for a few more people to come in, I do want to give you guys some really interesting information. I earlier did an interview with Nino Rodriguez, and the show he's going to put up either later tonight or first thing in the morning. And it's an awesome show. I had a ball doing it, and yeah, it was just a great show. And we will be doing a few more shows together in the near future. So lots of fun there. Um, Renee, if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to send you a co-host um, uh, invite, and I need you to kind of be a placeholder for Bridget, because just accept that and come on up, because they've already crashed the space once, and if they do that and I don't have a co-host, we could lose our space. So um, hopefully you'll be able to accept that and come on up. Up. All right. Let's see if I can get that sent to you again. All right. So we're going to go ahead and get started with the lesson. We're on chapter 10. Chapter 10 is titled The Present Ruling Class of Germany. And it starts out with Henry Morgenthau Jr., and says that he led the opposition within the US government to any reconciliation with Nazi Germany. He was at the time the Secretary of Treasury of the New York, he was a New York Democrat, and Morgenthau's views concerning Germany enjoyed relatively broad support in the US and won him some political allies in the Justice Department as well as the War Department. But the State Department specialists viewed him as a dangerous rival for their control of foreign policy. Morgenthau's popular appeal stemmed from his arguments against clemency for any Nazi war criminal. For much of the US public, German industrialists like Krupp, Friedrich Flick, and the IG Farben executives were an integral part of the Nazi power structure and could not be separated from the Nazi party at large. There were widespread suspicion in the US that Germany was, in some sense, intricately evil as a result of its embracement of the Nazi agenda, and that it should be stripped of its military capacity to conduct future wars. Limiting Germany, as Morgenthau supporters saw things, required a high degree of post war cooperation with not just the UK, but also the Soviet Union, which, of course, as we know, their agenda is to avoid at all cost. Morgenthau's legal advisors at Treasury favored a tough line on the war crimes. It was unthinkable that Germany would be permitted to legalize mass murder and the looting of an entire continent. If previous international agreements on war crimes had failed to deal with the Nazis' uh, agenda, then justice demanded that a new legal precedent be set as a result of what had just happened. Morgenthau's allies contended that substantially all of the economic, political, and military elite of wartime Germany was implicated in one way or another. Even so, the very fact that the Nazis had so efficiently purged their opposition suggested that the economic and political leaders who had survived the purges and gone on to prosper under Hitler's regime was part of the Nazi infrastructure. The Treasury Group's strategy for post war Germany favored what amounted to a massive antitrust action to break up the monopolies, the cartels, and the prominent feature of the German economy. They contended that German corporate leaders should be held personally responsible for the crimes that were committed. The Germans had been responsible for 2 world wars at this point, they reasoned, and the only way to prevent a third was to ensure that they were broken apart, particularly its heavy industry. Men and women at state who favored a strictly legalistic approach to war crimes usually backed in rapidly reintegrating Germany, companies and all, into the post-World War. George Kennan was among the first State Department officials to grasp the connection between Allied policy on war crime prosecutions and U.S. political and economic policy towards post-war Germany and the Soviet Union. He lobbied quite extensively in the early 1943 for Allies to abandon any effort to try Nazi criminals after the war. Kennan was a junior diplomat at the time, but he laid claim to comment on such questions because he was second in command of the U.S. diplomatic staff in Berlin at the outbreak of the war. Kennan had been interned by the Germans in a luxury hotel for several months. He had also long been a student of German affairs. Kennan wartime writings show that he was unable or unwilling to separate even the activities of the prison work-to-death camps from conventional war. The day we accept the Russians as our allies in the struggle against Germany, he wrote in a 1944 memo, we tactically accept as facts the customs of warfare which have prevailed generally in Eastern Europe and Asia for centuries. Kennan's moral and intellectual failure cannot be attributed to a lack of information about what was going on in the death camps. It was widely known at the time. Indeed, he wrote the memo precisely because of the Allies' discussion concerning what was to be done about the atrocities. Kennan continues in his memoirs, where he quotes the 1944 memo, that even after the war, when the record of the atrocities were laid out in gross detail, the Allied punishment for war crimes remained a particular reason for the unhappiness I felt over the post-war treatment of Germany. In a second memo, Kennan explained his objectives to purging Nazis from the German state and economic structure. First, the elimination of Nazi influence in Germany is impractical. The Allies could never cooperate well enough to carry out the task, and it would require a massive investigation that undoubtedly would be unpopular in Germany. Second, the most pertinent here, according to Kennan, argued that even if you could purge the Nazis, we would not find any other class of people competent to assume the burdens of leading the future Germany. Whether we like it or not, 9/10 of what is strong, able, and respectable in Germany has been poured into these categories which we have in mind for removal from power, namely those persons who have been more than nominal members of the Nazi Party, unquote. Rather than remove the present ruling class of Germany, as he put it, it would be better to hold it strictly to the task and teach it the lessons we wish it to learn. The same faction at state that was most committed to the revival of the German economy was also highly influential in the execution of wartime U.S. policy concerning refugees. Both issues were seen as foreign affairs, questions involving Germany, so both ended up on the desk of a handful of people at the State Department. Men like Eldridge Burbrow, R. Borden Reams, and John Hickerson prided themselves on their professed realism towards Germany in the midst of what they saw as a wartime hysteria that produced exaggerated reports that Jewish people were systematically murdered by the millions. Their most potent argument at the time was that only effective way to end suffering in Europe was to defeat Hitler quickly. Policies that they opposed were said to divert resources from the war effort, hence they were counterproductive in the long run. Meanwhile, the State Department's legal and political specialists, Green Hackworth and James Clement Dunn, operated on the assumption that Nazi persecution of German Jews and of non-Jewish Germans was an internal German matter and did not elevate itself to the classification of an international war crime. This was not a conspiracy, he said. These men did share common convictions concerning strategies for dealing with Germany and Russia, Soviet Union. As Kennan comments suggest, they reasoned that if the U.S. wished to avoid a post-Hitler social revolution in Germany, it would be necessary to have some non-Nazi Germans with whom to negotiate. They favored in brief that the U.S. make a sharp distinction between non-Nazi German economic and military elite on one hand and Hitler's inner circle on the other. They saw the former group as essential to Reconstruction. Hitler's inner circle, on the other hand, could be made a public example of. In this context, the wartime rescue of European Jews raised several problems. It would likely mean an increase in Jewish immigration to the U.S., which many at state opposed for political reasons. It would heighten U.S. conflicts with Britain over Palestine, and it would tend to criminalize the German economy and military elite in the eyes of the U.S. public, thus undermining longer-term goals as it related to Germany. This faction was not sympathetic to Nazism per se. Rather, it viewed Hitler, as Kennan put it, as stamping out the last vestiges of class differences, reducing everything to the lowest and most common denominator. Yeah, sometimes with people's lives. Interesting, both areas of debate over Germany within the US government tactically acknowledged that Germany's economic elite had been deeply implicated in the work with the Nazis, though the two sides had different opinions on what to do about it. The controversies over the Morgenthau plan for post-war Germany and the establishment of an international military tribunal at Nuremberg had to be hammered out. By 1943, most changes were also underway among the German economic elite. Up until the German defeat at Stalingrad in 1942, Adolf Hitler remained the best thing that had ever happened to the German financial elite from a business perspective. The sophisticated conservatives that dominated German business made the most of National Socialism. Virtually all major German enterprises adopted elements of Nazi ideology in their day-to-day operations, including purging Jews, decimating labor unions, and exploiting forced labor. Along the way, they invented a variety of rationalizations for their brutality and theft. By the early 1943, German financial and industrial elite began to split on the future of Hitler. Hitler had irrevocably blundered, it was rumored, and might be mentally unbalanced. because Hitler at that point had achieved what they wanted him to achieve. The banker, Heimler Slatt, long the German established banker who had backed the Nazis since before Hitler came to power, left Hitler's government. Even Oskar Henschel, whose weapons company made extensive use of forced labor, claimed to have concluded by December 1942 that the military situation was hopeless. The economic elite turned their attention to self-preservation. And what I find most interesting about that passage is the collective agreement that as early as 1942, they were not going to win the overt war. And when did they set up the stay behind units? Oh, coincidentally in 1942. The notorious Himmlerkreis of Circle of Friends of Heinrich Himmler is a good example of the dynamics of Germany's high-level business networks during the decline of the Third Reich. Nazi and leading German businessmen had jointly created Himmlerkreis in the early 1930s as an informal communication link between financial and industrial elite, and the SS Himmler sought the political and economic support of the business elite, and the elite in turn sought influence with those same people. Senior business leaders active in this organization, including Siemens, General Director Rudolf Bengel, Unilever, and Continental OI Director Karl Blessing, steel industrialist Frederick Flick, Dresdner Bank Karl Rock, and Emil Myers, shipping and oil executive Karl Lindemann, and other board members from Deutsche Bank, IG Farben, and Krupp, and a dozen other companies made up the German economy. As the SS grew as an economic power, the SS members of this community often shared positions on each other's corporate boards, where they could secure government contracts and embodied corporate loyalty to the regime. The SS men and Nazi Party activists who made this transition included Wilhelm Kepler of the coal mining organization, who was also an SS officer, Fritz Kranefuss, who was at Dresdner Bank, and Ritter van Holt of Deutsche Bank. Officially, these meetings were not for conducting business, because that would have suggested corruption. That's hilarious. But as a practical matter, the informal coordinating point for German industry negotiations with the SS were these meetings. The companies represented in Himmler's circle became pace setters in Aryanization, exploitation of concentration camp labor, seizure of foreign companies in occupied territories. So basically, they're using the Reich to fleece all of Europe. But as the war turned against the Third Reich, a number of business leaders in the group began to cooperate in clandestine, I'm going to say that again, clandestine contingency planning for the post-war period. That is the stay behinds. That is Operation Gladio. Two of the best known of these groups was, I don't even know how to pronounce the German versions of it, but the English translation is Working Group for Foreign Economic Questions, and the other one was called Small Working Group, were nominally sponsored by the industrialist and banks. They brought together Blessing, Kraut, Kurt von Schroeder, another banker, Lindemann, and others in this small circle of friends, and as well as Hermann Abs, ABS, from Deutsche Bank, who we've talked about before, Ludwig Erhard, who was an economist for all of them, and he later goes to work as the first chancellor, Konrad Adenauer's first economic advisor. Another guy was Westrich, who was in aluminum, and Philip Rienstesma, who did tobacco shipping and banking, and with Nazi business specialist Otto Ohlendorf, who was a commander of some of the assassination units. Hans Klare, SS business specialist, a half dozen similar business forums emerged out of this group. They all had overlapping memberships, and they were all made up of these corporatist people, as well as Himmler Schlatt, the guy that was notoriously known as Hitler's banker. A number of the top German corporate officials initiated attempts to reach Allied governments with offers to serve as intermediaries in the negotiations to save their own butt. Some of the international lawyers got in on this, one of which was Albert and Westrich's law firm, who was the brother of Gerhard Westrich, which was a member of this organization. And they also had ties to international lawyers like John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles. OSS man Allen Dulles became the focal point for many of these connections. They extended peace offerings to the Americans, basically trying to buy their own freedom. The German industrialists' role in these efforts was frequently been raised in their defense since the end of the war, because they already knew it was lost. Such activities are sometimes described as a form of resistance to the Nazi state, but it was not. The SS would remain in power even without Hitler, and so finally they say they usually insisted that the Western Allies tactically support Germany's ongoing war against the Soviet Union. And that's what it all came down to. That's the position, that was the carrot that was held out, that if you leave us in place, we will join your war against the Soviets, but you have to keep us intact. Some U.S. factions clearly supported the general concept of a separate peace with Germany, though very few others, other than Allen Dulles, knew the precise terms of the German emissaries had offered. John Foster Dulles advocated consideration of this strategy as early as 1943. There was also an undercurrent of support for a separate peace among some of the more conservative Democrats, like Harry Truman, who had an open mind as it related to the Soviet-German arrangement. Because remember, Truman is the guy that said, we'll support whoever's winning. We don't really care. Let them kill each other. Germany's industry efforts reveal the moral bankruptcy of this group during the last Hitler years. They proved to be willing to engage in conspiracies to protect their companies and their assets, but not to save the lives of anyone still in labor camps. Many knew, because at the time they're negotiating with the United States to save their own ass, they are working people to death. Many knew of Hitler's extermination programs, and some of them, members of the IG Farben and Siemens board, had personally procured slave labor from these camps and were engaged in the atrocities. Jewish blood became the currency in effect for which German companies bought legitimacy in the eyes of the Nazis during the Hitler's last years. Most of the members of German corporate elite were willing to sacrifice the lives of innocent people to ensure their businesses survived. So that's that chapter. I'm going to go ahead and go into chapter 11 a little bit, because this is where the rubber meets the road. This is when the trials begin.
Ma'am, would you add Stella as co-host?
Yeah, I tried adding Renee, but it never took. So hold on, I got to take her off.
Thank you.
Sure. Um, there you go. All right. So the Soviets placed captured Germans on trial for the first time in late 1943, less than a month after the U.S. Army Air Force had determined that it would not try Nazis for war crimes as long as imprisoned U.S. airmen were still in German hands. This was actually the second known Soviet trial, but it was the first to prosecute Germans. The Soviet Union had opened the first recorded war crimes trial of the war the previous July near the Turkish border in a southern part of the country. There they tried 11 Nazi collaborators accused of taking part in the murder of 7,000 Jewish civilians. The collaborators had executed the men by shooting them, the women and children by loading them onto closed trucks that had been modified with exhaust fumes from the vehicle, and they were basically gassed to death. They had painted Red Cross insignia on these vehicles so they were not bombed. All of that was attributed to SS Colonel Walter Rauff, RAUFF, who will return later in secret negotiations with Allen Dulles. During the murder campaign, the SS had enthusiastically reported to Berlin that they had saved German ammunition by killing them this way. It took a lot longer, and sometimes it failed. Otto Allendorf, who was in charge of the mass murder operation in southern Soviet Union, testified later that his troops experienced spiritual shock upon emptying the vans because the dead had covered themselves with vomit and excrement during the death agony. The Nazis eventually developed more efficient death camp technology in order to replace the vans. The Soviet court handed down prison sentences to 3 of the Nazi collaborators, then condemned the rest to death. The government encouraged a public celebration for the punishment and filmed the hangings. Trucks brought the prisoners to the hanging ground while executioners placed a noose around their neck. The trucks then slowly pulled away, leaving the man to die. The war crime trials that placed Germans on the deck for the first time were held in Kharkov, Soviet Union, in December 1943. The Soviets prosecuted 3 captured German commandos and a Soviet collaborator. They were all convicted and hanged. The Soviet announcement of the verdicts made direct reference to the Moscow Declaration on Nazi crimes of a month earlier. This was clearly the type of quick justice the Soviets had in mind. The Nazis were judged on the spot by the people that they had committed crimes against. Henry Morgenthau was at that moment struggling with the State Department to win approval of the U.S. program to aid European refugees, particularly those facing gas chambers. He issued a statement congratulating the Soviets on the trial, noting that executing these commandos, the Russians are wiping off the face of the earth the most repulsive stain of the war. But the State Department and the British Foreign Office were aghast at the trials and Morgenthau's response to them. Their concerns were amplified a week later when the Nazi Party newspaper published a front-page photo of a captured U.S. pilot whose bomber jacket was emblazoned with a notorious gang's name. U.S. air gangsters named themselves Murder, Inc. The headline read, "The prisoner was said to illustrate an underground character of air terrorist." Coverage of this in German newspapers stressed the pilot's destruction of civilians, including German women and children. The State Department interpreted the publication as a threat to what they were going to do. Secretary of State Cordell Hull quickly announced that as far as the U.S. was concerned, the direct handling of war criminals did not fall within the terms of the recently signed Moscow Declaration, an ambiguous statement that raised obvious questions because it did. Just what the declaration did cover. So, Green Hackworth's office at the State Department dispatched a message to the Germans via a Swiss government person promising that the U.S. had no intentions of trying captured German soldiers. Western press reports claim the U.S. and Britain appealed to the Soviets to postpone any further trials. State Department's political advisor, James Clement Dunn, huddled with colleagues in the State Department over what to do about Morgenthau. The War Department distributed internal directives to U.S. forces stating suspected Axis war criminals then in captivity were not to be separated from the general POW population, nor was there to be any indication that they were under suspicion. The practical effect of this order was to sharply restrict U.S. efforts to collect any information about Nazi atrocities, including those that had been committed against the U.S. military. There was no effective way to investigate Nazi war crimes without actually asking questions about whether or not you're a Nazi. The Western concerns over POWs then in German hands carried little weight with the Soviets. The Nazis had systematically murdered 2 million Soviet POWs through starvation, gassing, and torture since 1941. Holding off any trials was completely unacceptable to them. Herbert Pell's arrival in the UK. Now, remember, Pell is the guy that no one in the State Department likes. That's the friend of FDR that they lied to for like a year, trying to keep him out of the UK's war crimes organization. So he finally gets to the UK. Pell had no office, no telephone, and he didn't even actually have an office address. The commission existed. The members would meet once a week and decide to put off the definite organization until later. Then they would all go home. After 2 months of frustration, Pell turned his energy to the task of taking substantive action from the bureaucracies he believed was stifling the war crimes investigations. This is what he had to say. The only book I read in preparation for the War Crimes Commission was a life of Antoine Tinville and the course of the Committee of Public Safety during the French Revolution. When the French Revolution was well underway, a great many of the government officials were holdovers from the old administration. Royalist and anti-government plots were going on all over the country. The Committee of Public Safety was organized, and Tinville was put in charge. And then the terror began. I wonder if there's any relationship to the Committee of Public Safety and the Office of Public Safety, because every time the Office of Public Safety went into a country, they started terrorist organizations. A considerable number of people were executed, just like with the Office of Public Safety. Many of them should have been perhaps only put in jail. A good many of them should have been let go completely. Many of them were innocent. Yet the overall result of the activities was that royalism was suppressed. I felt that we were facing much the same situation in Germany. It was far more important to prevent a third world war than anything else. Our business, however, was to see that those things did not occur again. And he said, I believed, and I still believe, that it would have been best to hang the entire Gestapo. That's the way Pell felt about it, which is, you can see, is why none of the people in the State Department wanted this guy in charge of anything. Pell's thinking was much in tune with public opinion of the day. 9 out of 10 British men and women favored harsh punishment for Nazi leaders. The British Institute of Public Opinion reported in 1943 some 40% of Britons favored summary execution of Nazis without a trial. 15% called for torturing them before you killed them. So yeah, they were a little pissed off. In late January 1944, Pell wrote to Roosevelt and to Breckinridge Long, supposedly the guy that was his supervisor, seeking support for the first of several hardline initiatives he wished to raise at the commission. In the letter to Roosevelt, Pell pushed for international tribunals to try Nazis who had committed crimes against citizens of more than one country, or who had directed inhumane policies in Germany itself. Pell was referring, obviously, to these death camps. Pell knew Breckinridge long well enough that it was pointless to appeal to him on behalf of the German Jews. Instead, he argued that Allied radio propaganda had led quite a number of Germans to commit sabotage against the Reich. Some of those rebels were said to have been caught and persecuted by the Nazis. It does not seem to me proper to abandon these people merely because we cannot find any German statute which they had violated. FDR responded to Pell on February 12th in a personal but ambiguous worded letter that lent moral support, but not really any commitments. FDR's letter favored military rather than civilian tribunals because such people know or should know what the rules of warfare are and should be able to detect violations of those rules. In fact, however, the State Department archive shows that FDR's telegram to Pell was actually written by Pell's arch rival, Green Hackworth, the man most active in the state's attempt to throttle Pell's authority. White House passed Pell's letter back to state to draft a reply, where it ended up on Hackworth's desk. All of the surviving FDR and State Department letters to Pell during 1944 were actually drafted by Hackworth. Regardless of whether the notes went out over the signature of the president, the Secretary of State, or Hackworth himself, they all had carbon copies indicating Hackworth drafted them all. Roosevelt did not place a high priority on the discussions over war crimes once the toughly worded condemnations of the Nazi atrocities had been noted. So he was all about words and nothing about deeds. Hackworth explicitly ordered Pell to avoid the War Crimes Commission's consideration of atrocities against any Axis civilians. Regardless of what Hackworth or Roosevelt may have intended, however, Pell interpreted the FDR note as support for his own hardline positions. He succeeded in convincing most of the rest of the War Crimes Commission that Roosevelt was behind him. I guess two can play at that. Hackworth's position on these questions was strongly backed by Lawrence Press, Preuss, who was Pell's assistant. Press evidently had secret orders from the State Department to undermine Pell in the commission. So this Lawrence Press guy was sent over basically to be Pell's assistant. And he was sent over there specifically to sabotage him. Pell confronted Press shortly after his arrival of Hall's directive to suppress the war crimes inquiries into crimes within the Axis countries. Shouting and waving his arms, the giant Pell cornered him and insisted that Hall's narrow legalism would have to be swept aside. New law will have to be created if necessary, Pell insisted. The failure to prosecute would be a mockery of justice. Perez claimed in secret reports to Hackworth that Pell also met with representatives of major Jewish organizations in Britain and in the U.S. to urge an organized campaign to enforce some type of accountability. Press assignment in London was nearing its end. He leaked word of Pell's actions to the British Foreign Office before he left, painting the U.S. representative and several other commission hardliners as unstable eccentrics. Pell was making dangerous mistakes, he said, while the Czech representative, Dr. Iser, was said to be wild, unbalanced, and indiscreet. Pell sent a decidedly negative evaluation of his assistant's work back to Washington, stating that he had defied orders and violated confidentiality rules, but Hackworth ignored them. He gave him a promotion and a raise. Foreign Minister Anthony Eden had appointed Sir Cecil Hurst as a British representative to the War Crimes Commission and basically ensured that it was him and not the U.S. that got the chairmanship. The Foreign Office regarded Hurst as a model of experience and was unlikely to make waves. But Eden seriously underestimated his appointee. Cecil Hurst joined Herbert Pell in engineering a basic shift of the international law in early April 1944. Hurst submitted an official report on the first 4 months of real work that the committee did. He stated bluntly that the stirring wartime pledges from Allied leaders that justice would be done to Nazi war crimes would come to naught unless the Foreign Office changed its approach to Nazi atrocities. The Allies had submitted only a few cases to the commission, he reported, and those involved relatively minor incidents. The U.S. had not contributed any information of war crimes at all to the commission. Hearst also pointed to the magnitude of the task that confronted the tiny commission. By now, it was abundantly clear that Nazi atrocities that involved tens of thousands of perpetrators would be a scale so enormous that there was no way the small committee could handle it. Hearst was attempting to gain for the group a new authority and vigor. No longer would it be possible for the Foreign Office and State Department to use the existence to claim they were doing something while not doing anything at all. His demands gained urgency on May 15th when the Nazis struck Budapest, the largest surviving center of Jewish population in Europe. Hungary, a full Axis partner since the beginning of the war, had long since made preparations for killing Jewish people. Yet its government had generally held back from mass murder, much to the dismay of the Nazis. In March, the Germans deposed the existing regime and installed a more compliant government, whose principal task was basically mass murder. The Nazi and their Hungarian collaborators carried out this destruction with speed, efficiency, and thoroughness. Within 10 days, they had deported 116,000 people to Auschwitz, many of them family and children. They shipped 250,000 more people to extermination camps before the end of June. The Nazis gassed as many of these people as they could and put the rest in work camps. The Allies knew of the slaughter, but they failed to stop it. Worse, they formally declared in secret decisions that the perpetrators of this crime were to remain immune from prosecution for what they were doing. Lord Simon of the British War Department opposed any investigation into the Hungarian deportations. It would only be confusing, using his word, from a legal standpoint if those who had deported the Hungarian Jews were included in Allied war crimes list. He contended. The Foreign Office representative, Sir Alexander Cadogan, strongly concurred. Lord Simon secured an official rejection of most of Hearst's proposals for the War Crimes Commission and went so far as to argue that even the murders of Americans, Poles, and French citizens in Nazi concentration camps were legal under German law and therefore not subject to war crime tribunals. And again, you have to think of the logistics of moving these people over vast spaces of railroad, and they did nothing to stop it. They didn't bomb the railroads. They didn't do anything to stop the mass murder. 3 weeks later, the Soviets seized Majdanek, the first true death camp to fall into Allied hands, more or less intact. Nazis had gassed to death more than 1 million people at this location, murdering an average of well over 15,000 people a week, half of whom were children. This was one of the small extermination centers compared to Auschwitz. Pravda carried an extensive account of the camp, complete with photographs, cremorias, human bones. The tabloid London Illustrated News soon picked up the pictures and ran them as well. But the mainstream media refused to accept any of it, calling it basically Soviet propaganda. The war correspondent Alexander Worth, Werth, prepared an extensive story for BBC during early August, but his supporters suspected that it might be a Russia propaganda stunt and refused to air it. The New York Herald Tribune response was similar. Maybe we should wait to have it corroborated because, it might be Russian propaganda. So that gets us 2 chapters down. And then we go on to talk about next time, which will not be tomorrow, by the way. Well, maybe. I'll tell you why in a second. So the next one is Morgenthau's plan, and it's fairly short, so we'll probably be able to get 2 out of the way. It's also going to talk more about the actual trials. So tomorrow, there is a really fun car show scheduled during our normal time that I plan on attending, so I don't plan on having our 4:00 show tomorrow. However, it looks like it might rain, and if it rains, we will have the 4:00 show. So just be advised of that. And for those of you who joined us late, we did record the interview with Nino Rodriguez, and it is going to be out definitely by tomorrow. He said he may have it out tonight, but definitely by tomorrow. It is definitely a great interview. Love doing it, and I will be back on his podcast soon. We've set up a couple of other dates to do that as well. Really cool guy. I really enjoyed it. So, Operation Gladio takes another step forward to many more people. He has a huge audience learning what it is and what it's all about. So, any comments over the material?
I say it all the time, Colonel. I realize, and a lot of people, and I was in spaces this past weekend, and people are like, oh, this Operation Gladio, it was so many years ago. It has nothing to do with today. But the thing is it does. I mean, yes, it was something from a long time ago, but a lot of the players, it's like a rank and file type of a thing. They get promoted to take over, like through the family or however, marriages, whatever it is, however they do it. But it's the same stuff over and over again. And it's so important that we understand how this happens so that it doesn't ever happen again, because literally, holy crap, we have been completely infiltrated.
What most people don't understand is the tactic. The tactic is still being used every day. Tactics don't go away. Sometimes tactics can be modified based on advanced weaponry, but how you fight a war, basically, tactically, is consistent over time, especially when you're talking about covert operations. If you go and look at the curriculum that was taught 30 years ago, 40 years ago on how to conduct counterinsurgencies, other than adding in new advances in technology, the tactical level of conducting a counterinsurgency is very much still the same. And all Operation Gladio is insurgency operations in order to take down a government or to create chaos or whatever their stated objective is using these terror cells. So it's chaos begetting control. That's not something old. That is something that's still with us today. And anybody that says that's an idiot. And you can quote me on that.
And there's a lot of idiots out there.
Yes, there is.
Well, I just see that things are really amping up, whether it's in spaces on X, and then I think Cousin It just posted something about the CIA, how there's even more of them, on here and stuff like that. And, it's like everything is being attacked and trying to get divided upon. And that's exactly what these people did in other countries. And people don't see that that's what's been going on here for a very, very long time. And we don't even really realize it. It's not happening here in the U.S., and all the same thing. I mean, just 5 years ago, they had everybody in a lockdown for fear of whatever this COVID shit is, which is a cold, in my personal opinion.
Well, everything, BLM, Antifa, all of it. It's chaos agents so that they can control us. January 6th, I mean, it's all the same thing. Yeah. If you can't, go ahead.
And recognizing the tactic stops you from the knee-jerk fear reaction. And when these tactics no longer work, they stop using them.
Well, you hope they start.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Once they've been outed, they have to change their playbook. Renee, go ahead.
Hey there. Sorry, I don't know why you send me the invite to co-host, but it never allows me, and then I got kicked off. It's some weird glitch, so sorry about that.
That's okay.
But hey everyone, and congratulations on the Nino Rodriguez interview. Where can we watch that and what time?
So he just posted, if you go to his page, he has his own television program channel on one of those networks. And I reposted it on my thread, but he probably posts less than I do, so you might be able to find it on his easier. But I reposted it just before we started, saying that, it'll be live within the next 24 hours.
Okay,
I'll post it again.
Great. Also, I wanted to, I guess, we started this today with chapter 10, and then we went to 11, right?
Yes, we did 10 and 11 today.
Okay, so on chapter 10, I had a kind of thoughts about that because you were talking a lot about the banking system involved in this.
Yep.
And I wanted to bring up to you recently, I guess yesterday you posted something on Twitter about the in Brazil, the defense of tradition, family, and property that you came across.
Yes, that's crazy. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So connections to that was kind of digging into it. And the bankers were over in Brazil. I would say, in the 20s, there was this thing called the Montague Mission.
Yes.
Norman Montague.
Yep.
And so they were all in Brazil for the natural resources, the gold, the rubber, the coffee, the sugar.
Yep.
So the banking system was over there in Sao Paulo. And it first was the Montague Mission, and they were trying to reorganize the whole lending, banking situation there. And then later it went over to the Niemeyer Mission. And I guess the Montague Mission was in the 23 or so, 24. And then the Niemeyer Mission was around 1930, which was that was Otto Niemeyer, also from connected with the Rothschilds, Bank of England shenanigans over there. And around that time in the 1930s, I guess Brazil was kind of had it with the whole Jesuit mission, the strict Catholicism, and the people were going in a direction of wanting to be free and capitalism and all this stuff. So the Catholic Church, once again, connected with the bankers, kind of was involved with creating a re-Catholicism of Brazil at that time.
Correct.
And the guy who started that, what's his name? His name is Plinio Correia de Oliveira or whatever. He was the guy who created that tradition family group in the 60s, but
Correct.
He started other stuff in the 30s.
Yes.
Around the same time as all these bankers were getting their stuff set up there. And what's super interesting, I find, because in South America, they, with the Opus Dei stuff.
Yes.
And these guys, the Vatican had all their fingers throughout Brazil and in the bankers, and especially recently I kind of went on a dig of Opus Dei, and there's this gentleman who wrote a book named Gareth Gore, and he connects Opus Dei with Banco Popular. Banco Popular was in Spain, and the creator of Opus Dei was a Spanish guy, and he and Franco were buddies, and they were kind of friends. So he was another traditional, Catholic guy, very strict Catholic branch, and it's super interesting because in the book that Gareth Gore wrote, he shares the connection of Robert Calvi when, he was hung under the bridge.
Yep.
That Opus Dei, the Vatican, there was this money found missing.
Yep.
And it was connected to the Vatican.
Yep.
And Gareth Gore points out that this money that went missing seemed to be funneled into Opus Dei. So I'm not sure, I need to dig more, but it seems there may have been a repositioning of finances and stuff into this offshoot of this traditional Catholic stuff called Opus Dei on this other group that I just looked into. But it seems that the bankers, the Vatican, they were in cahoots in South America even, before Nazi Germany. After World War I, they were snooping around, sending, because as you shared, they're sending around their missionaries and stuff.
Yes.
To find the natural resources.
Yes.
So, and it just makes complete sense to me. So thank you for helping connect dots and stuff. I even found some wacky information that Pope Leo, the new one is what, 14?
I don't remember. I think so. Yeah.
Our current new Pope is Leo the 14, I think. So Leo the 13 was a huge fan of something called Mariani wine. And
yes, in Peru.
Yes, it was wine mixed with cocaine.
Yes.
And a lot of the elites were into this drink, and the chemist who made this elixir and these potions, where was he from? So anyway, it's fascinating stuff, all these connections. I just wanted to share all that with you. I'm
Thank
still
you.
digging on all of it.
And that organization is like the World Anti-Communist League. They were very anti-communist. And it's almost like the Catholic version of the World Anti-Communist League. They were in all countries to include America. They had branches everywhere. And what I also find very interesting, since you brought up Brazil, if you look at Brazil and how critical it was, and what she's talking about is basically and we know that we couped Brazil in the 60s, but we had been instigating stuff in Brazil long before that, and playing a very active role. If you look at the western border of Brazil, you find Paraguay. And what's interesting about that is the waterway that goes up along Paraguay goes down to the Atlantic Ocean. And northern Paraguay is mountainous. And that's where you find the Unification Church and all of the Moonies with their like hundreds of thousands of acres, hectares, whatever, of opium farms, with the Bush's Paraguay quote unquote ranch right beside them that borders that waterway. And of course, we know what happened in Paraguay with Operation Condor. And just below that, Uruguay, we know what happened in Uruguay. And right beside that, Argentina, where all the Nazis went. And of course, they fanned out into Paraguay, Uruguay, and Brazil. You find them everywhere down there. We know that they were in Chile, which, oh, by the way, is right next door to Argentina, at the colony Dignity. So all of these things are connected.
Yes, and if I may add that, I don't know if you all remember, I guess what it was, a year or so ago, that big flood that was in the state of Rio Grande do Sul, which is the port of southern Brazil. And historically,
We lost you, Renee.
is where they all the gold and precious resources. And they had some railroads in the south, which connected to Argentina and Paraguay, and the one in Paraguay connected to Bolivia. So it was in Rio Grande do Sul. This is where they had international airports and a lot of ports that would go to Europe and so forth. So it seems like this is where they sent their pirate booty out of. But anyway, there was that big flood that flooded the whole bloody state and ruined the ports and everything.
Darn.
So anyway, just interesting note.
Yeah. It's all connected. So thank you for that, Renee. That's an awesome research in connecting all of those dots, because they are definitely all connected. So anybody else got anything? Nope. All right. Let me look over here. Craig Mutley, did we get an American Pope due to the Vatican having gone 3 times greater in debt under Francis and their pension funds being upwards of $500 million underfunded? Who knows? I have no idea. I know people are making a big deal out of that. I have no idea, because the new Pope has some very questionable connections to a lot of what we've uncovered. So anyway, thank you guys for being here, both on Rumble and on X, for our lesson of the day. And we will continue with, go ahead.
Sorry, Renee has her hand up.
Go ahead, Renee.
My head's spinning by what she was just saying and all the connections too, as well. So I'm just flabbergasted.
Yep.
Yeah, okay, so to update you all on the current Pope, he, interesting stuff learning about Opus Dei, because Opus Dei is connected in the United States to the Heritage Foundation, which, and what else? It's a little creepy because it's connected to some of our Supreme Justices too, to Leonard Leo, to Peter Thiel. I can try and share some things another time. I'm driving right now. Sorry.
Sure, no problem.
Last week, Trump posted on Truth about him not liking Leonard Leo, because Leonard Leo is Opus Dei. He's not the Heritage Foundation. Tucker Carlson is sponsored by the Heritage Foundation, by the by. And Peter Thiel, Leonard Leo, I think, helped put in 2 of our Supreme Court justices. The woman,
Barrett, Amy Coa Barrett.
Yes, her, and then another one.
Kavanaugh.
Trump is not. Yes, exactly. Thank you.
Sure.
And so Leonard Leo is a very hard right, religious, I guess if you would consider like the Jesuits kind of crazy Democrat like Gavin Newsom, he's the opposite of that, like fascist hard Catholicism. Maybe you can kind of look at it that way.
Both sides of the same coin. Both sides of the same coin.
Yeah, the polarity, the Democrats and the Republicans, that whole rodeo.
Yeah.
But the Peter Thiel thing, gosh, I can't remember the name of his organizations, but we believe it or not, we have this stuff intertwined currently to this day. And but the Pope also, a week or 2 ago, the new Pope Leo, he is stressing really hard reform on the Opus Dei. So that's a good thing.
Yep.
He's pulling in the reins. So regarding, because I was completely on the fence with this new Pope. Oh gosh, what is this? Did he,
Well, and again, the lesson that we just learned is don't pay attention to the rhetoric. Pay attention to what they do.
The message, not the messenger, right?
No, the act, not the message. Because he can say that he's going to rein in Opus Dei while winking and not doing a damn thing. Right? And that's our lesson in all of this. The lesson that you're going to get out of the Splendid Blonde Beast is our government repeatedly talking about doing something while at the same time sabotaging anybody who tries to do something about accountability at the end of World War II. And had they held those people accountable, the Nazis wouldn't be flooded all over the world that continued to wreak havoc, to include today, because Bandera and Stetsko and all of those people would have been held accountable for war crimes as well. And so saying something doesn't mean a hill of beans. Doing something means everything.
Yeah, exactly. I'm still curious of the connection of his Chicago connections.
Me too.
That's the big question mark there with his Chicago.
Because he was at the Chicago Archdiocese when Marcinkus was there.
Exactly.
So hopefully he didn't learn any bad lessons. But anyway, anybody else? Nope. All right. We're out of here, guys. Thank you for being here. Again, we're going to play Tomorrow by Ear. Next week, I'm going to try to get done with this book before I leave. And then we will have shows, but they will not be necessarily a book. They're going to be some of these articles that I've been saving that we may just do an article. And I'm not going to guarantee we'll be able to do it at 4 o'clock every day, because I'm going to be traveling for about a month throughout the middle of June through the middle of July. As you guys remember, a friend of mine's taking group command out in Texas, and I'm going out there for his ceremony and to see my daughter and to visit Air War College and find out whether or not I just overlooked all of this crap and it's actually in the library there where I got my master's degree, or whether or not they're actually censoring information to propagandize senior military officers. And I will be reporting what I find out from there. So, anyway, I was going to say if I'm not arrested, but I know I won't be, because I'm authorized to be there. I'm a graduate. But anyway, probably won't go back after I report what I find, though. Anyway, y'all take care. I will either see you tomorrow or Wednesday. But again, I will let you guys know as soon as we get an accurate grasp on the weather tomorrow and whether or not we can go to that car show. So take care, everybody. And we'll be in touch. And I will let you know as soon as the show goes live that Nino is doing. Take care. All right, guys, I'm out of here. Thanks for joining us. Take care.